Next presentation is by Anton Vinogradov, and the title of his capstone is The Paradoxes of Parliamentarism in Albania and Moldova.
Yes, my research study focuses on the government systems of two post-communist countries, Albania and Moldova. So both of these states have parliamentary constitutions that vest executive power in the government and do not grant considerable executive authority to the president. According to the constitution of these two countries, the president's powers are largely symbolic and ceremonial. At present, these constitutional principles are being followed. The prime ministers of the two countries set the agenda for implementing public policy, while the presidents remain detached from the decision-making process and day-to-day politics. However, what's unusual is that it's not always been the case like that. Between 1992 and 1997, President Sali Berisha was the indisputable leader of Albania, who not only determined the country's internal and foreign policies, but also jailed the political opposition and curtailed press freedoms. In Moldova, Vladimir Voronin was the first president elected under the parliamentary system, but he was essentially the man running the show between 2001 and 2009. He directed the country's protean foreign policy and set the agenda for the government's internal policy, whilst also displaying the authoritarian tendencies exhibited by Berisha. So here's an interesting paradox. These countries had parliamentary systems with very powerful presidents. How were Berisha and Voronin able to both reign and rule, in the understanding of Lord Macaulay and Bernard Bogdanor? This is my main goal. The main goal of my research study is to answer this question. I have come to a conclusion that informal rules and arrangements were more important than constitutional frameworks in determining the de facto distribution of power in these two countries. Both Berisha and Voronin were at the top of what Henry Hale calls patronal pyramids, and could therefore count on the support of an army of sub-patrons staffing the government, the parliament, and the courts. I will therefore focus most of my presentation on how this played out in both of these countries and hopefully draw some comparative conclusions. So, Sali Berisha was born in a poor peasant family, but became one of the country's most prominent cardiologists in the late 1980s. We have to bear in mind that nothing substantial happened in Albania in 1989, unlike the rest of Eastern Europe. In 1990, it was still led by an unreformed communist party, although the leadership took baby steps to liberalize the economy following the death of Enver Hoxha in 1985. But after Rami's Aliyah, Hoxha's handpicked successor, witnessed what happened to Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, he realized that it was about time to start some moderate political reforms. And this enabled Berisha to speak out against the regime. Berisha adopted a highly confrontational style and called for the introduction of a multi-party system. Albania's most famous intellectual at the time, however, was writer Ismail Kadare. But he defected to France in October of 1990, which propelled Berisha to the forefront of the dissident movement. Although the student demonstrations that erupted in Tirana in December 1990 were triggered by the deteriorating living conditions, Berisha was able to persuade the students to call for political pluralism. It is important to note that although he was prominent leader of these, he became a prominent leader of these demonstrations, there were other notable leaders as well. For instance, Gramos Pashko was a well-respected economist, and Azam Haidari was the main organizer of these demonstrators. He was a 28-year-old philosophy major before that. So, Aliyah was essentially forced to concede because workers also supported these demonstrations. And he allowed opposition parties. He set a date for the first multi-party parliamentary elections. Berisha, Pashko, and Haidari then created the country's first opposition party, which they called the Democratic Party. A number of other opposition parties popped up in early 1991, but the Democratic Party was undoubtedly the largest and most popular of them. In February 1991, Berisha was elected as the party's chairman. He was able to present himself as someone who was well-educated and knew a lot about Western values. He was able to travel abroad as a cardiologist, and also he studied in Paris. And but at the same time, he was also able to show that he understood the plight of ordinary people, because he came from a poor family from an impoverished region in the north of the country. He was therefore able to combine the best qualities of Pashko, who was seen as a competent economist, but came from a privileged family. I mean, his father actually was a deputy prosecutor general under Hoxha, and Haidari, who was close to the crowd but wasn't as debonair as either Berisha or Pashko. In the run-up to the first multi-party election, Aliyah attempted to follow in the footsteps of Gorbachev by empowering state institutions, which had previously been fully subordinate to the party. Aliyah, in addition to being the first secretary of the Labour Party, was also the country's nominal head of state, bypassed the party by assuming personal control of the country and created a presidential council dominated by conservatives. At the same time, he appointed Fatos Nano, a 39-year-old economist who supported gradualist economic reforms, as the new prime minister. Like Gorbachev, Aliyah was trying to balance between conservatives and reformers. The Communist Party also presented a draft constitution that created the office of president, which received extensive powers. For example, the president was allowed to abrogate acts that were deemed unlawful or irregular, and he was also allowed to preside over government meetings. But unlike the Soviet Constitution, the amendments to the Soviet Constitution, the draft specified that the president was to be elected indirectly. The Communists were able to win the first multi-party election, in large part because the Democrats lacked the financing and administrative resources to reach out to the peasants, who made up the majority of the population. The Communists attempted to get the new parliament to approve a modified version of the draft that they had presented, but it was shot down by the opposition and even some pro-reform communists. The Democrats and other opposition parties wanted a weaker president. And once again, the communists were forced to compromise by proposing a constitutional law that limited the powers of the president. Although Aliyah easily won the presidential election, or selection to be more precise, he was also forced to resign as the first secretary of the Party of Labour and ceased being the most influential politician of the country. The government essentially became the locus of executive authority, and but it was actually forced to resign several weeks later because of a nationwide strike organized by anti-communist workers. The communists were forced to create a coalition cabinet in which the Democrats and other opposition parties had a considerable number of seats. But Berisha did not join this cabinet. The most senior Democrat in the cabinet was Pashko, who became the Minister of Economics. In June, the Communist Party also changed its nature and started positioning itself as a socialist party, a social democratic party, adopted the name Socialist Party, and elected Fatos Nano as its chairman. And he started calling for, obviously, gradualistic marketization reforms. As the government failed to contain the chaos that spread throughout the country, Berisha became increasingly critical of it and eventually called for its resignation. Pashko then attacked Berisha for his disruptive tactics. Although Pashko enjoyed the backing of the presidium of the party, Berisha's increasingly radical approach was supported by the majority of its members, and even the majority of the population. In December of 1991, the Democratic Party said that it would only stay in government if President Aliyah agreed to its ultimatum, which included a demand for a new parliamentary election in 1992, and the arrest of Najmiya Hoxha, who was the widow of the late dictator. Aliyah agreed to most of the demands, but the Democrats still pulled out of the government. By 1992, the Democrats had definitely become the most popular party in the country. They now had the resources to reach out to the countryside, and most peasants stopped supporting the socialists because of the coalition government's chaotic land privatization program. Within a matter of 2 years, Berisha, a doctor who was largely unknown to the public, had become the most popular man in the country. The Democrats therefore won more than half of the vote in the March 1992 election on a promise to make the country European and to attract international aid. Humiliated, Aliyah resigned as president. Although it was initially speculated that the Democrats would invite Kadare to become president and that Berisha would become prime minister, this did not come to fruition. Berisha was elected president and, in accordance with the law, stepped down as party leader. The Democrats immediately passed a constitutional amendment that expanded the powers of the president by allowing him to set the agenda for the cabinet meetings and to propose popular referenda to Parliament. Pashko and other moderate leaders who had formed their own faction within the party had hoped to become prime minister or party leader, but Berisha gave them the cold shoulder by appointing Alexander Muxi, an uncharismatic Berisha loyalist, as prime minister, and Edward Salami, who had emerged as Berishah's right-hand man during the campaign as the leader of the party. Pashko and other moderates who supported gradualism and criticized Berishah for his radicalism were expelled from the party in August 1992 and went on to form their own party, the Democratic Alliance, which wasn't popular. In 1985, party leader Salami also voiced some of his disagreements with Berishah and was promptly replaced by a more loyal follower, Tritan Shehu. Thus, Berishah was still the most important and influential person of the Democratic Party, and in fact eliminated his opposition within the party in order to maintain this position. He implemented shock therapy and developed close ties with the West, particularly the United States. Although the economic chaos subsided, economic non-intervention also led to the appearance of criminal networks and pyramid schemes. Initially, Berishah echoed Václav Havel by saying that Albanians bore joint responsibility for the survival of the dictatorship, and that he would refrain from going after the most communist officials, except for the most egregious and corrupt supporters of Hoxha, such as his widow, Nejmiya. However, he proved to be no Havel when he jailed both Aliya and Nano on charges of abuse of authority and corruption. Nano had emerged as Berishah's most vocal critic, who was supported by the southern part of the country, which had enjoyed a more privileged status under communism. Thus, from the point of view of patronal politics, Berishah's moves can be seen as attempts to emasculate the opposition within his own patronal pyramid, the Democratic Party, and to weaken the primary alternative pyramid, the Socialist Party, by going after its leader. Although Berishah failed to win popular support for the expansion of presidential powers in 1994, he continued to expand his powers by using the security services to browbeat the opposition and the independent media. Even the United States began to express its concerns with the developments in Albania after the parliamentary election of 1996, in which the Democrats won more than 3/4 of the seats in parliament, and which were noted for widespread irregularities and the use of security forces to intimidate independent and opposition monitors. Ultimately, Berishah's regime was brought down by the collapse of pyramid schemes in 1997. Albanians lost more than $1 billion in savings and took to the streets to demand justice. Protests began to spread from the south, where many blamed Berishah personally for their financial losses. Berishah responded by appointing a coalition government that included socialists but maintained personal control and was in fact re-elected for another 5-year term by parliament. As protests turned into looting and chaos, Berishah was forced to concede to the demands of the socialists and released Nano, and he organized an early parliamentary election in June 1997. The discredited Democrats lost the election, and Berishah stepped down as president in July. Recep Mejdani, a senior Socialist Party member, succeeded him, but yielded most of his authorities to Fatos Nano, who became the prime minister. The 1998 Constitution of Albania solidified the parliamentary form of government, and there has been no backtracking to the de facto presidentialism ever since. In fact, in 2005, Berishah came back to power, but this time as prime minister, and he served until 2013, and now he's been succeeded by a socialist prime minister, Edi Rama. Unlike Albania, Moldova initially adopted a semi-presidential constitution in which the president was to be elected directly by the people and was to share executive authority with the government. The first two post-communist parliaments were dominated by umbrella parties that lacked internal discipline and smaller parties that did not have enough MPs to form a government. Charles King delineates 3 distinct blocs that existed in Moldovan politics in the 1990s. The Pan-Romanian bloc led by the Christian Democratic Popular Front, the centrist bloc led by the Democratic Agrarian Party, and the pro-Russian bloc led by the Unity Movement for Equality and Rights. Although the centrist bloc dominated the political scene of the country, there was a lot of squabbling between its leaders. Mircea Snegor, who served as a president between 1990 and 1997, Petru Lucinski, who succeeded him and also served as Speaker of Parliament before that, and Andrei Sangeli, who was Prime Minister for most of the 1990s. These disagreements stymied the implementation of much-needed economic reform, which contributed to the deterioration of living standards. It was in this milieu that Vladimir Voronin, leader of the Party of Communists, emerged as one of the country's most influential politicians. Starting out as a bakery manager, Voronin, an ethnically Moldovan native of present-day Transnistria, advanced through the ranks of the communist administration and served as the Soviet Republic's interior minister during the anti-Soviet demonstrations of 1989, which he obviously opposed. The victory of the Popular Front put Voronin out of power, But in 1993, he co-founded the Party of Communists of the Republic of Moldova and quickly emerged as its sole leader. The new Communist Party appealed to both ethnic Russians and ethnic Moldovans dissatisfied with their economic predicament. In the parliamentary election of 1998, the Communists emerged as the strongest group in parliament, but were blocked from forming a government by the Alliance for Democracy and Reforms, a tenuous alliance of centrist political parties. The collapse of the alliance and President Luchinsky's growing frustration with the dysfunctionality of the parliament prompted him to propose changes to the constitution that would have made Moldova a presidential republic. As a riposte, parliamentary speaker Dmitry Diakov proposed amendments to limit presidential powers and introduce indirect presidential elections, a move that Diakov believed would turn the president into a mere figurehead. Eventually, Diakov won out thanks to the support of the communists, who were also disappointed with Luchinsky because he did not allow them to form a government. As Luchinsky's term was about to expire, the communists nominated Voronin to succeed him. The centrists could not come up with a strong opponent, but Voronin still failed to obtain the necessary number of votes to win the election in the year 2000. So Luchinsky was forced to dissolve the parliament and announced a snap parliamentary election for February 2001. The communists managed to win more than half the vote, thus easily obtaining the necessary number of seats to elect Voronin president. Voronin also stayed on as party leader, unlike Berisha, which enabled him to win parliamentary support for most of his proposals. In stark contrast to the centrist umbrella parties and movements of the 1990s, the Communist Party had a strict hierarchy and enforced party discipline. Like Berisha, Voronin appointed lesser-known loyalists to the important positions of prime minister and parliamentary speaker. Voronin relied on mechanisms used by communist one-party states in a multi-party country. So he was leader by virtue of being the leader of the Communist Party, not by virtue of being president. Although he was still generally referred to as President Voronin. Voronin therefore concentrated greater powers than his predecessors, even though the Constitution limited presidential prerogatives. In 2003, he was able to restrict media freedom by increasing penalties for libel and getting the Parliament to pass a law against extremism. Voronin was also in charge of the country's foreign policy. Although he initially attempted to pursue closer relations with Russia, he realized that the Russian solution to the Transnistrian conflict which would have turned Moldova into an asymmetrical federation, would have alienated ethnic Moldovans and the political right. He was therefore able to present himself as an independent, pro-European politician by spurning the Cossack Memorandum. And in fact, he attracted the support of the Christian Democrats and was able to win a second term, in large part because he did that. However, he was not as powerful as some of the authoritarian leaders of the post-Soviet space. For example, his attempt to make Russian the second state language failed because of popular protests organized by the Christian Democrats in 2002. Like Berisha, he was unable to prevent defections. Prime Minister Vasily Tarlev, who was seen as an immediate follower of Voronin, resigned over differences with the president in 2008, and Parliamentary Speaker Marian Lupu also defected to the Democratic Party in the aftermath of the April 2009 parliamentary election, when there were reports of irregularities, and these reports actually triggered massive protests, which were dubbed the Twitter Revolution. Since the communists won only 60 seats in that election, and 61 was required to elect the president, they could not elect their candidate, Prime Minister Zinaida Griciani, as the new president. Voronin could not serve more than 2 terms, but he intended to stay on in power, and in fact, hailed comparison to Deng Xiaoping in that sense, that he wanted to stay on even without having even without holding any formal positions. But he did get himself elected as the Speaker of Parliament. He was forced to dissolve Parliament after it failed to elect a new president. And in the new elections, the opposition was able to win essentially a majority, and Vlad Filat, the leader of the largest opposition party, the Liberal Democratic Party, was able to become prime minister. And since then, the government has been exercising the coalition government has been exercising has been holding most of the authority that was previously held by Voronin. And so now Moldova has a president. It finally managed to elect a president in 2012, but he's essentially a figurehead, and most of the decisions are taken by the government. My presentation has hopefully shown that both Voronin and Berisha were at the top of their respective patronal pyramids, which roughly coincided with the two parties that they led. This conclusion should not be a reason to overestimate, however, the importance of political parties in the parliamentary systems of Eastern Europe. For the most part, parties served as proxies for voting for or against their leaders. I mean, the electorate couldn't vote directly for either Berisha or Voronin. My research has also shown that that there are perils to that parliamentarism has its own perils. To paraphrase Juan Lentz, who saw it as the best constitutional arrangement for countries transitioning to democracy. When one party led by a charismatic leader such as Berisha or Voronin manages to win enough seats to form governments, elect presidents, or change the constitution, the risk of authoritarianism becomes real. And this is apparent today in Hungary, although there it's the prime minister who is exhibiting the authoritarian tendencies. One question that remains unanswered is why Berisha and Voronin chose to become presidents in the first place. If their parties had the majority of seats in parliament, they could have easily become strong prime ministers like Vladimir Mečiar or Orban. Instead, they opted for a ceremonial position. Unfortunately, the primary sources, which are mostly periodicals that I have been reviewing, so far have failed to provide me with a satisfactory answer as to why they became presidents and not prime ministers.
Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
Yes, Professor.
Yeah, Anton, very informative, interesting presentation, giving me a lot of food for thought. And one of the things that springs to mind is the role, or the perceived role, of presidents as heads of state, dealing with foreign governments, you say, in foreign policy. And so I wonder, do you think that might have been part of the attraction for having that be one's official title? In other words, did these politicians think, well, my party title doesn't matter so much because I know I'm in charge of the party, but if I'm president, do you think it's something to do more with the international perceptions?
Yes, I think that did play a role, and also the president was a little more secure than the prime minister. A greater number of the parliament couldn't unseat him as easily as the prime minister, and so. But yeah, definitely, I think that there was this prejudice that presidents had a certain a certain level of authority that they could, and that they actually kind of symbolized that they were the symbol of the nation, and that they symbolized the national unity. Although they obviously didn't represent all of the factions in the country and didn't represent all the clans. They were able to essentially formulate their own foreign policy, because in a government, the prime minister would have shared that responsibility with the foreign minister, and they definitely didn't want to share responsibility with everyone. I mean, both of these men exhibited pretty authoritarian tendencies and tried to rein in the opposition within their own parties, as I've said.
Well, that's fascinating. So they wanted to be the father of the country, have the perception of having a mandate, even though they weren't directly elected. So therefore, someone who dug into it would say that's not a mandate, but somehow in appearances.
But I mean, I think in many post-communist countries, right, it's much more natural to go to a presidential system than to a real parliamentary system. Where a really democratic one.
Well, yeah, they're mostly semi-presidential, is that right, Anton?
Yeah.
Yes. Most East European countries adopted semi-presidential constitutions, but what's unusual is that Albania adopted a parliamentary constitution, but essentially that constitution was initially formulated by the communist government, and the communists were trying to kind of emulate Gorbachev. Although Gorbachev's constitution prescribed a directly elected president, he himself was elected indirectly.
Yeah.
So they were kind of trying to, I guess, get the best of both worlds in that sense. And the Democrats didn't do anything about it. They just kept the old constitution, adopted a few. I mean, it wasn't really a constitution. It was just it was a law, constitutional law that functioned as a constitution. The Constitution of Albania was only adopted in 1988 when it officially, where it specifically stated that Albania was a parliamentary republic. And since then, and since the collapse of Berisha's regime in 1987, it's definitely it's become a parliamentary republic in practice.
Yeah. So the timing of the constitutional decisions is also really interesting.
Yeah, and in the case of Moldova, obviously, it's also the timing of the presidential election, because Tulichinsky's term was about to expire in 2000, and so Voronin seemed like the natural candidate to replace him. because he was the leader of the party that had the majority of seats in Parliament. Although hypothetically, I still don't understand why he couldn't have nominated someone from, like a loyalist from his own party to replace Luczynski and himself become prime minister.
I think with Orban, we have that example that his
Yes,
loyalists turned out to be
that's
not a very competent
yeah.
person.
Well, it doesn't really matter. I mean, because the prime minister was the main decision
Right,
maker.
yeah.
So, in the case of Hungary, and then yeah, it didn't really matter. I mean, in the case of Slovakia, we obviously Mečiar thought that he had appointed a loyalist, but he wasn't no loyalist. I mean, he eventually turned against Mečiar, the president there. So there was, I guess, it could be that Ronan also had Slovakia in his mind, possibly, where the president. And so he thought that by being president, he would maintain control of his patronal pyramid.
I don't want to hog all
Yeah, I
discussions,
think,
so
yeah,
we'll stop.
Other questions? Comments? Peter?
Up
Yeah.
there.
I wanted to ask a little bit about where exactly they were getting the money to even set up these patronal pyramids to begin with. If Beresha was from the far north and was a cardiac surgeon, I assume he wasn't like a captain of administrative contacts, to give him all this money. So did they form coalitions with the local oligarchs? Did they manage to nationalize other resources to be able to move themselves forward? Specifically curious about Beresha because he was a doctor from the north rather than Verona, who was apparatchik.
Well, they were supported by workers, essentially. What's ironic is that Bereshah's party came to be supported by most industrial workers and miners, whereas the peasants continued to support the communists for a while. And so, but obviously most of this, he received funding from the West. The United States initially believed that he was going to be a democratizer, that he truly believed in democracy. And he used to quote Kennedy. Obviously, that attracted the West. So he was able to cater to, but his main power base was workers and the North, because the workers was the class of people who was most hurt by the stance by the economic policies of Hoxha, and that those were like isolationist policies, and because the country was trying to be autarkic, the peasants actually had some could still get food, but the workers relied on food from somewhere else. So they were the most impoverished class, and they were antagonized by the policies of the communists, which is of course ironic.
Yeah, but it still doesn't ask you a question about where the money came
Well,
from. So
then-
it's
Well, I
probably-
said the West.
There wasn't enough money to
There
hold
wasn't,
together.
yeah, the workers didn't give enough money. I was just
Yeah.
referring to the support where he got the
Yeah.
support,
Right.
but the money came from the West mostly.
Right.
And later on, of course, when businesses started popping up in Albania, some of them did support, and there have been allegations that Beresha got kickbacks from these pyramid schemes, but so far Bereshah's been denying them, and I've seen pretty controversial evidence. I mean, some scholars have argued that yes, he received support from these pyramid schemes and from even criminal networks, and that's people like Miranda Vickers, and others like Iles Biburai have defended him and said that these are unfounded allegations. So it's not exactly clear as to I can't quite get to the source of that. Obviously.
I'll make this be all over that. Thank you very much.
Other questions, comments? Thank you.